method that you would use,
Mhm.
method that you would use that has a already defined function. I don't know if I'm explaining that right.
That's one way of putting it. Yeah. Anyone else want to take a stab?
Is it when a function calls another function inside the function?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, both are correct. And essentially the key here is we're working with some let's say terminology that is a bit higher level. It may not be used so much or practically in like a day-to-day manner when you're actually at your place of employment working on code with your team, but it's useful to learn now and to understand because it will help you think more abstractly about how all of these things work later on. Plus, it's good to know for when you're doing your interviews, right? If you're able to explain these things comfortably in the middle of an algorithm challenge, that's gonna look good on you. So let me see. Am I sharing my screen yet? Oh no, I don't want to share that one. Let's back up a bit. So we're going to talk about, yes, we're going to talk about higher order functions. Well, let's also talk about how functions in JavaScript are first class citizens, right? Is that what they're called? Because they, unlike simple and primitive data types, have an extra layer of complexity. And in addition to this, when you use functions that call other functions, which changes their, I guess, naming convention into a higher order function, you're adding another layer of abstraction to what you would normally doing if you were just manipulating variables and primitive data types. And some of the benefits to this are cleanliness in code, right? It's clearer separation of tasks and functionality, but that also can have some disadvantages. Let's say you're troubleshooting some code that you're not so familiar with. Every time there is that kind of abstraction, that's an additional step to trace when you're trying to reverse engineer your way from an error and going through a lot of code in the process. And it might not seem like a big deal because it really is just one step, right? But while troubleshooting, you might find yourself repeating a process over and over and over again. And so it could add up. It could add up to the amount of time it takes total to troubleshoot an issue and identify the source of what's happening. Okay, I did want to share the screen. That was the right one. Like looking for another screen, and there is no other screen. Okay, so let's talk a bit more about the built-in higher order functions in JavaScript because those are things that you'll want to use. They're there, they're available for you. They're things like map, filter, and reduce. And actually, I'm going to switch screens one more time. Here, let's look at the curriculum before we actually dive into writing out some code. So, right, we are going to be looking at a few built-in functions. So, um, map, for example, is available and you can just call this whenever. And what it really does is it just takes a value and it can, or it will take, it will look for the values that you're looking for and it will map them to a new array. And it doesn't actually manipulate the data in the original array. It creates a new array. So in this example here, we have a function called double, which doubles the value of an element. And when you apply that, or I should say, when you apply map passing in this double function to an array, what you'll get as a result is the output of that function for each value within the array. We'll type that out in terminal in a sec to see how that works. We'll then talk about filter, which will search for the values that you were looking for, and again, output them as a new array, leaving the original array alone. And then finally, we'll have reduce, which unlike the other two, will output everything into a single result. And from there, we'll write out some of our own higher order functions because it can come in handy knowing how to do that. So let's switch over. Okay. All right. I am inside of JavaScript terminal. So if you want, open up your terminal, follow along. We're just going to hop inside a Node.js environment. And from here, we can start writing out some simple functions like, well, we'll take that double function that was inside of our README, and we'll start there. So function, double, and the variable that will, the argument that we'll want to accept. In this case, we'll just call it element, and then we will return that element multiplied by 2. And so if I now apply this function and I pass in an element, I'll get the output that is the element multiplied by 2. And from here, let's talk about how when a function is considered a higher order function, it's not only that it can take in another function, but it could also be the output of another function, or it's even assigned to a variable. So we could assign, let's say, 2 doubled. We'll create a variable called 2 doubled. And what this is going to be this method or a function with a parameter or argument being passed in as 2. So now if we call 2 double, we'll get the result of this original function and the argument that has been hard-coded in. So there are different ways, basically, to manipulate, not really manipulate, but yeah, let's say manipulate data using functions within other functions. So all of this you'll want to keep in mind when you're writing out your code because it can help influence how you write your code. Let's see. Let's try a few more things. We're going to do something, another simple function here. Let's do something like square. So we're going to take an element and just like before, all right, somebody tell me how to finish this.
Return element times element.
Yes, exactly. Element times element. All right, let's test this out. We are going to test with the number 5, and we get the value that we want. And now let's do something a little more complicated. We have a function that can square an element. Let's create a function that will utilize filter to return perfect squares. So let's do function find perfect squares. And what we're going to take in is an array of numbers. And we'll do something like return array.filter. And what's happening here now is the array that we pass in, we will apply the filter function on. And the filter function will expect this kind of a syntax, this argument. So we have a number, for example, this is our elements, and we'll use this equal sign and greater than sign. And what this is called lambda notation. So this is a lambda function, also known sometimes as a fat arrow function. So we're taking this number. On the left side is the elements, the arguments that we're manipulating, and on the right side is the expression. So we're going to take a number. We're going to use another built-in Java or JavaScript function to see if this is an integer. So it's going to take this number. It's going to call isInteger, which is a function that belongs to the number library. And we are then going to call another function, square root, from the math library. And this is where we'll finally pass in the element that we are defining on the left-hand side of this lambda. Okay, so now if we take this and we pass in an array of numbers, let's just go all the way up to 9. It will give us all of the perfect squares that can be created from this array. Any questions on that? Let's go back to that to map. Let's go back to that example that was inside of the README. So we're going to create a new variable called double, or I don't know, 3 doubled. And oh no, the example wants an array. Array double. So now we're going to take an array. We should probably define an array first. And now we can apply the map function on this array. So we'll say double array equals my array. We'll call the map function, and we're going to pass in the logic that we want to run on this, which is the double function we created earlier. And so this is now going to apply to every value inside of the array. So let's look at the results. We have exactly what we were expecting. So I don't know. All of this is pretty simple, right? So far. Okay, I see some nods.
Just when you inside the map you call double, but you don't put in an input. You just write the name of the function, but it's not like, because the function was defined like you need to have an input to it. A variable, but you're not putting that there, but it still knows that it has to go through the array.
Yes, it does. And that's a very good question.
Which is interesting to me. Well, yeah.
Oh, it definitely is. But let's see if we can break down what's going on here. I think the best way to look at this is, yes, you're right. When you're first learning JavaScript and you're learning how functions work, you are taught that when you call a function that takes in an argument, you also have to pass in values to that function. Also, you have to use a parenthesis notation to call that function, right? So with that line of thinking, you would think that this would require an argument to be passed in, but map is it's a function that's built into JavaScript, and by design, this is how it behaves. So you're passing in a function, right? You're not actually calling that function. You're passing that function into map. Map knows to then take every value of the array it's being applied to and pass it in to the double function. So there's some magic going on behind the scenes that you can really only know once you start to read the documentation behind how map works. Does that make sense? Let's actually take a look at some documentation. I don't know if anyone's talked about this yet, but one way to look at being an engineer, a software engineer, is it's 90% reading documentation. So let's take a look at our map function. So, can't stretch this. Let me know if the text is too big, too small. In this example, we see that we have an array 149, and when we call this map function, what's happening is the numbers, which are at each index of this array, are being passed into this function, math.square root of the number. So this returns a list of roots. Now, what is the purpose of map? Map will create a new array using these results, as opposed to any kind of manipulation of the original data. But more in line with your original question, let's see if we could find why it behaves the way it does. Let's see. Okay, let's look at the syntax. So when we look at the syntax, it's telling us that what it wants is a callback function. So that's really all we need to pass in, a function to execute for each element in the array. And again, the key here is you're not calling the function, map is. Map is executing the function as a callback function. You're just passing in that logic to map. Does that make sense? Cool. So you'll find this a lot with, especially like built-in functions like map or a filter, or even like more complex ones. They might behave in ways that don't seem to follow the logic that you're learning. And in those cases, reference the documentation. Okay, back to, how are we in time? Okay, still pretty early. Let's go back to VS Code. All right, so we've covered map, filter. I guess let's do reduce. So in this example, let's say we'll have our same array, my array. We'll then create a new variable called sum, I guess. Well, we want sum to be 0. And then we'll write a for loop where in JavaScript, our arguments for a for loop are the initial argument is kind of like where we want to begin. So we want to start an index of 0, and we want to go until we reach the length of the array. So my array dot length. And I want to make sure, did I abbreviate my array? My array, where's my array? My array, okay. And then we will increment by 1 for each step of this for loop. So what we're going to do is we're going to increase the sum with each value in the array, giving us the total sum of the array that we're passing in. So what is our array? Oh, 1, 2, 3 will return 6. Now, using this in the context of reduce, what we're trying to do here is we want to get the sum of every element in an array. And if we were to write this out as a function, as opposed to this for loop, let's see how that would work. Like, let's do something like function sum, and we would pass in accumulated and the current element. Whoops. And, oh man, I cannot type. Let me just start this over. Okay. Yikes. I'm going to call this sum2 because my fingers kept slipping and hitting the wrong keys. So some function sum2 is going to be the right function doing the stuff that we wanted to do. And now let's try passing in some values to sum2. So let's say let's return value equals my array dot reduce sum. And what is this? Oh, right, we're doing sum2. Oof. All right, we're going to do return value 2. Okay, return value 2. What is this? All right, we got 6. So we saw in the first example, we wrote the logic for summing up everything inside of an array using a for loop. And then in the second example, we have a function that takes in 2 arguments. And we use reduce to return whatever that function returns will then be passed as the first parameter. Man, I do not like this example. I'm sorry. I'm not a big fan of this example. Okay, let's look at this more complicated version of this example. So let's call this return values 2 equals my array dot filter. Oh man, it's gonna require some methods that we skipped. I say if you have some time before you go through the challenges, run through the README real quick, so you could see firsthand in your own terminal, if you haven't been already, how some of this logic works. And from there, we can open up breakout rooms, have you dive into the challenges, and again, push your solutions. And let me just look to see if there's any other examples we could run through. Okay, we did the perfect squares example. I don't have another example for reduce, unfortunately, but again, basically, it's taking a collection of data and boiling it down to a single value. Oh, let's see. I think that's about everything. It's not a very complex lesson. We did write our own higher order function earlier when we wrote find perfect squares. Yeah, I'll open up breakout rooms. You could take a quick break right now. If there are any questions, ping me or the TAs, hop into the main room, and we can troubleshoot together. Sound good?